Hello, everybody. Welcome to Chapter 5, Market Efficiency and So-Called Market Failure. I need my little pen here. So what do we look at in Chapter 5? We look at the concepts of how so-called consumer and producer surplus relate to allocative efficiency, which we were introduced to in Chapter 2. So you recall in Chapter 2, we had a production possibilities curve, and the production possibilities curve, we have two products, quantity of A and quantity of B on the two axes. And every point on the production possibilities curve is productively efficient because every point is the result of the economy using up all of its resources. And we said that there's a single point on the production possibilities curve that is allocatively efficient. So the point of allocative efficiency is the point that society prefers to be along this entire curve. Okay, so we look at how the concepts of consumer and producer surplus relate to this point of allocative efficiency on the production possibilities curve. And then the second little topic deals with how so-called external benefits and external costs lead to a point of non-allocative efficiency on the production possibilities curve. So if we have so-called external benefits, otherwise known as positive externalities, or external costs, otherwise known as negative externalities, we end up at a point someplace else on the production possibilities curve other than this point of allocative efficiency. Okay, then the next little section briefly talks about how we can end up at a point of non-allocative efficiency on the production possibilities curve if we have so-called asymmetric information. And then the final little section very briefly talks about if we have so-called public goods or so-called common property resources, then again society ends up at a point at a non-allocatively productive point on the production possibilities curve. So if we have public goods, so here's our point of allocative efficiency. If we have public goods, we could end up at this point here, or common resource goods, or common resource property resources, we could end up at this point here. And so it's a non-allocatively efficient use of resources in our economy. So before we jump straight into Chapter 5, I thought I would highlight a theme in this book because I thought if I brought this theme to your attention, it may help you pull some of the subsequent chapters together as we're going through them. And the theme that I want to highlight to you is this theme of allocative efficiency. So just before we start to Chapter 5, I'm going to try to explain to you how the society or how the economy arrives at this point of allocative efficiency on its production possibilities curve. The book doesn't really explain it, but I want to tell you what the theory is behind why society ends up there as opposed to down here or over here. Okay, and then I'm going to very briefly explain how this point of allocative efficiency on the production possibilities curve corresponds to the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantities in our product markets. Because what we're going to see is on our production possibilities curve here, we have quantity of product A, quantity of product B. This equilibrium quantity determined by the product market, it is the same quantity that we see in the production possibilities curve. Of course, we have two products. So we have QB. We have two points in the production possibilities curve. Okay, so I'm gonna explain to you how the supply and demand diagrams relate to this production possibilities curve. And then I'm giving you a bit of a heads up of what we're going to see in some subsequent chapters that also make use of this concept of allocative efficiency. So in a few weeks from now, we'll be in Chapter 8, and Chapter 8 deals with the so-called nature of the nature of the firm, nature of a business, and the nature of a business is to produce a profit-maximizing quantity of output, which is kind of what we'd expect to happen. And then what we're going to see in Chapters 9 through 11, economists classify industries into four types. We have perfect competition, we have monopoly, we have monopolistic competition, and we have oligopoly. And what we're going to see is when some of the companies in these industries, when they produce their profit maximizing quantity, we're going to find that that quantity is less than the equilibrium quantity that we find on our production possibilities curve. And so when these industries produce a quantity of output that's less than equilibrium quantity, we're not on our point of allocative efficiency. We're at one of these other points along the production possibilities curve. And then what we're going to see in Chapter 12 is that if there's a non-optimal amount of quantity getting produced in one of these industries, then that gives governments a justification for regulating that industry and forcing the producer to increase its quantity of output in order to bring the society, in order to bring the economy back to its point of allocative efficiency. Anyway, so this theme of allocative efficiency underlies a number of chapters, and so I thought I would just kind of give you a bit of a heads up about it today. To help you understand some of the context of this chapter and some subsequent chapters, or some subsequent chapters. Okay, so now I'm going to try to briefly explain how society arrives at its allocatively efficient point on the production possibilities curve. Okay, so here we have the production possibilities curve. So this diagram calls it the production possibilities frontier, but it's the same thing, it's a curve. And we have two products. So we have food, this is quantity of food on the bottom, and we have quantity of clothing on the y-axis. So a bit of a review from Chapter 2. So every point on this production possibilities curve is a consequence of the economy fully utilizing all of its resources, all of its inputs. So we said before that there's only one point on this production possibilities curve that is allocatively efficient. Oh, I can't spell that. And that represents society's preference. Of all these possibilities, all these little possible points, there's only one that society prefers most of all. How does society get to that point rather than another one? So what we don't tell you in this course, you know, when I think about it in hindsight, you know, this is an introductory course in economics, and so we spare you some of the theory, but I thought I would give you a little bit more theory just to help you understand how society arrives at this point of allocative efficiency. So the production possibilities curve alone is comprised of these two quantities: quantity of food in the bottom, quantity of oh my goodness, what happened to my quantity of clothing on the y-axis. And so the economy has a certain amount of financial resources in it, and people, if they had to spend all of their income on only these two products, this so-called indifference curve represents the different quantities of the two products that the society would purchase at different prices. The slope of this indifference curve at any one point represents the relative price of the two products represented on the two axes. And so when the two curves are just touching each other at this one point, this point of touching, this point of intersection, is the point of allocative efficiency, point of allocative efficiency. So it's a single point. So when society spends all of its income on these two products, clothing and food, it wants to purchase this quantity of food and this quantity of clothing based on the total amount of income available in the society and based on the relative prices of clothing to food as represented by the slope of this point of tangency. Anyways, that's how society, that's the economic theory about how this point of allocative efficiency is arrived at. It's the economy spending all of its income on the two products based on its preferences and based on the prices of the goods. Okay, so the next little thing I'm going to try to explain to you. So this is what our chapter talks about, is how the point of allocative efficiency in the production possibilities curve, how it corresponds to the equilibrium quantity in the product markets for these two products. So the chapter explains it, but I'm going to explain it with diagrams instead. So here's our production possibilities curve, PPC or PPF, whatever we want to call it. And we have two products. We have food on the x-axis. Here's our quantity of food, and we have clothing on the y-axis, quantity of clothing. So let's say, for example, this is our point of intersection with the indifference curve. So this is a point of intersection with our budget in our economy. So at this point of intersection, this is the quantity of food that the society wants to purchase, and this is the optimal quantity of clothing that the society wants to purchase. So we can map these two quantities back to our supply and demand diagrams. So we're familiar with these supply and demand diagrams. We saw last week or the week before that the equilibrium price is set by the interaction of the demand and the supply curve for clothing. So here's our equilibrium price, here's our equilibrium quantity, and then when we do a supply and demand diagram for food, again we have our demand curve or supply curve, and in a free market the equilibrium price is set by the intersection of those two curves, and there's our equilibrium quantity. So the quantities that come from these supply and demand diagrams, they map exactly across to the quantities on the production possibilities curve. And what we're going to see in chapter 5 here is that if we ever end up at a point, at a non-efficiently allocative point on the production possibilities curve, that means that we have overproduction or underproduction in these product markets. And as we're familiar with reading chapter 5, if we have overproduction or underproduction with respect to this point of equilibrium quantity, if we have overproduction or underproduction, we have the so-called deadweight loss. And so if our output in either or both of these two product markets is something other than the equilibrium quantity set in the product markets, we're at a non-allocatively efficient point on the production possibilities curve. That's the diagram that kind of complements the explanation in the chapter this week. Okay, so let's just move over to the chapter, and then we'll be back to my little diagrams here in just a minute. Okay, so the first topic in this chapter is the concept of consumer surplus. And the book gives us a definition of consumer surplus. It's the difference between the maximum amount that consumers are willing to pay and the actual amount that they pay based on the fact that there's only a single price in a market using our supply and demand curves, where the price is set by the forces of supply and demand. So we're going to see how this concept of consumer surplus gets illustrated on the slides, because it's also explained in the book. But I was going to try to explain it to you in a slightly different way by sort of highlighting the role of discriminatory pricing. This chapter does talk a little bit about discriminatory pricing, and we will come back to the concept of discriminatory pricing later on. I think it's in chapter 10. But anyways, here's my explanation of consumer surplus. So I imagine that there's a concert in Edmonton, and it's let's say it's a Justin Bieber concert, and the ticket promoter has some tickets remaining, and so the ticket vendor wants to sell these tickets. So the ticket vendor has a little contest and says, hey, if you're interested in seeing Justin Bieber, let me know how much you're willing to pay for these tickets that I have remaining. And we kind of have to keep in mind, or we should kind of keep in mind, that all of the seats that are available, they're all in the same section of the arena or the concert hall or whatever it is. So they're all kind of equally equivalent seats. So let's say the vendor, we're going to see in a moment here that he only has 5 tickets. But let's say we have 10 people expressing an interest in buying these tickets. So when these people go to the vendor, they have to say how much they're willing to pay for these tickets, and how much they're willing to pay represents how much enthusiasm they have for the performance. So we have 10 people respond to the offer of the vendor, and these are the possible ticket prices over here. So person number 1 offers a price of $100. Person number B offers a price of $90. Person number C offers a price of $80. Person number D, price of $70. Person number E, price of $60. Person number J, a price of only $10. So obviously person J is not that enthusiastic about Justin Bieber music. Okay, so this effectively is our demand curve for these tickets. And then we know from the last chapter, when we calculate the total revenue in a market, it's simply price times quantity. So here's our demand curve from these 10 people. And here's our supply curve. The vendor only has 5 tickets, so the supply curve is perfectly inelastic. And our supply and demand curve, they intersect at $60. That's the equilibrium price. That's our equilibrium price corresponding to quantity of 5 tickets. So our revenue, total revenue, if the vendor sells the tickets at $60 a piece, he's going to sell 5 tickets, $60 a piece, and it's going to generate revenue of $300. So this is the market that we've learned about in previous chapters, and I've sort of phrased it in the negative, but it's when the price is established by the intersection of the demand and the supply curve, and that is a market without price discrimination. So now we're going to contrast that situation with a market where the vendor does practice so-called perfect price discrimination. So it's the same situation that I described before. We have a ticket vendor, he's got 5 tickets, has a little contest, has people write in, say, hey, how much are you willing to pay for these tickets? And person number A, it's the same 5 people as before. Person number A is willing to pay $100. Person number B is willing to pay $90. Person number C is willing to pay $70, and so on. So the vendor only has 5 tickets for sale. So our demand curve really doesn't extend down to these other vendors, to the other potential buyers. So in this situation where the vendor practices so-called perfect price discrimination, the vendor effectively takes advantage of the information that the prospective buyers have provided the vendor, and the vendor sells the tickets not at the intersection of the supply and the demand curve, but the ticket vendor sells each ticket individually to each buyer at the maximum price that that buyer was willing to pay. So person number A was willing to pay $100, so person number A pays $100. Person number B was willing to pay $90, so person B gets charged $90. Person C gets charged $80. Person D gets charged $70, and person E gets charged $60. So again, we only have 5 tickets that get sold, but the total revenue that the vendor generates in this case is $400 rather than the $300 in the situation of no price discrimination. So when we want to explain it, when we want to look at this concept of consumer surplus, we start with the total revenue. I go to blue, don't look right. We have the total revenue that the vendor receives when he practices perfect price discrimination, which is $400. Remember, it's only 5 tickets. Same 5 tickets, and only in the first 2 scenarios. So the vendor charges this price, this price, this price, this price, this price. Okay, and then we have the total revenue that's generated by the vendor that charges the same price for all the tickets. So that's where the supply and demand curves intersect. So here's our demand curve, here's the supply curve. It intersects at $60. And the difference in those two revenues is $100. So when we diagram that $100 on this chart, the $100 is represented by this blue area. This is a consumer surplus. So if the market charges a single price, the equilibrium price of $60, in all 5 buyers, all 5 consumers pay the same price, the market as a whole is actually deriving this additional benefit from not getting charged on a discriminatory price basis. So the consumers gain this calculated value of $100 if the vendor instead practice a discriminatory pricing, then the vendor takes all the consumer surplus. But if the vendor charges a price that's determined by the interaction of supply and demand, forces of supply and demand, then the consumers enjoy that consumer surplus. So the consumer surplus is the amount of extra benefit that consumers receive rather than when the price is set on a discriminatory basis. I just want to make that correction. Receive. Okay. So now let's go back to the slides, and we'll go through them. So okay, because we're going to see the same diagrams again. So our demand curve, the demand curve represents the so-called marginal benefit. We know that as we consume more and more greater quantities of an individual good, the benefit we receive declines. And the marginal benefit is the extra amount of benefit that a consumer receives from consuming an extra unit of that product. So that's so the height of the demand curve corresponding to these units represents every unit of output. Remember, this is all quantity on the bottom. Every unit brings a certain amount of benefit, and the benefit is represented by the height of the distance between the x-axis and the slope of the demand curve. And so when a consumer consumes an extra unit of product, the purchaser's total benefit increases, but it increases at a decreasing rate. And we will come back to this. We will come back to this in subsequent chapters. Okay, so here we have the same diagram of the consumer surplus that I tried to draw. So here's our demand curve. Here's our supply curve. If the price in the market, if the price charged by the market is set at the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, then all the consumers pay the same price. But we know that the different consumers derive different levels of benefit from consuming the product, or if one person consumes more than one unit, the amount of benefit for the incremental unit declines. So if all the consumers pay the same price, the difference between the horizontal price line and the demand curve represents this consumer surplus. The demand curve represents the area under the demand curve to the quantity represents the amount of revenue that the vendor would receive if he practiced price discrimination. But if the market price is set by the intersection of supply and demand curve, then the vendor only gets price times quantity. He only gets $5 times 3, which is 15. And this extra value goes to the consumers instead. And of course, if we have perfect price discrimination, there is still consumer surplus, but it's the vendor that takes the consumer surplus rather than the consumers. Okay, so then the book does try to explain the concept of price discrimination, but their example is a little bit different than mine, because in my example, with the Justin Bieber tickets, I had 5 tickets. We had perfect price discrimination because each consumer paid the maximum amount for every product. In the book's example, they also illustrate price discrimination, but theirs is not perfect price discrimination. Theirs is known as second degree. It's known as second degree price discrimination, and it's based on volume discounts. Second degree price discrimination is based on volume discounts. So the example in the book is a golf course. And at the golf course, here's our demand curve, here's our supply curve. I mean, a golf course has a fixed quantity of number of holes that can be played per day. It takes people a certain amount of hours. There's only a certain number of holes. There's only a certain number of people that can play at a certain time. So the supply curve for playing golf at a golf course is fixed. The demand curve slopes downwards to the right, as we would expect. And in the example in the book, the golf course charges customers $60 per round. But then it says, hey, if you buy an additional round, we'll give you the next round at half price. So the original consumer surplus, if the vendor charged this equilibrium price of $30 a round, then this consumer surplus would go to all the consumers. But if the vendor practices price discrimination, this second degree price discrimination, based on this volume discounts, then the vendor takes this portion of the a consumer surplus, and then the consumers are only left with this little triangle here and this little triangle here. So in the example here, the way it's designed is that the vendor takes half the consumer surplus that consumers enjoyed when the price was set at the equilibrium price. And so when the vendor practices price discrimination, the vendor takes some of the price discrimination, or takes some of the consumer surplus. So you'll notice in this diagram, I kind of want to point something out to you here, because when we come to chapter 10, your brain might ask yourself a question, and I'm going to try to answer the question. So even in this example here of second-degree price discrimination, when the golf course sells its first round of golf, it charges $60, and then it has this second round for half price, and the total quantity supplied by the golf course is still the same that we would see in the absence of price discrimination. The question is, if the vendor practices price discrimination, I'm going to put it this way, is price discrimination allocatively efficient? If the vendor practices any form of price discrimination, perfect price discrimination, second degree, there's also a third degree that we won't get into. If the vendor practices price discrimination, is this allocatively efficient to the society? And the answer is yes. Why? Because the total quantity that the vendor supplies is this quantity here. The total quantity that the vendor supplies is the equilibrium quantity. And when we go back to our production possibilities curve, and we have these two axes with the two products, clothing and food, the point of allocative efficiency is determined by quantities, not by the price. So even if the vendor does practice, so this quantity is going to make it onto this curve, as long as the final unit is sold at the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity as a whole is achieved, then yes, price discrimination is allocatively efficient. It's kind of an interesting concept, and we will come back to it in chapter 10. It sounds a little bit counterintuitive because, you know, in ordinary language, we tend to think that the word discrimination represents something that's not desirable. And it's true, sometimes acting in a discriminatory manner is not desirable. When we have discrimination on the basis of race or age or gender or ethnic background or religion or something like that, that is not socially desirable. But discrimination per se is neutral, and discrimination can be positive. If you discriminate in favor of going to a vacation in Mexico rather than California, if you discriminate in having this person as your friend rather than that person as your friend, that expresses your personal preference, and that's actually a positive form of discrimination. Anyways, what we're going to see in chapter 10 is that when we talk about monopolies, it sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but when monopolists practice perfect price discrimination, they produce a higher level of output than they would produce if they did not practice price discrimination. Anyways, we'll get back to that. We'll get there in chapter 10. Okay. So now we have an analogous concept. The concept of consumer surplus applies to the consumers, and then we also have this concept of producer surplus. So the producer surplus represents the difference in value that the vendors receive when they receive a single price for all their output, rather than the price, the graduated price represented by the supply curve. And it's based on the concept of marginal cost, and we will come back to this in subsequent chapters, but the supply curve is the producer's marginal cost curve. Anyways, we'll come back to that in subsequent chapters. Okay, so the marginal cost is the amount that a producer, amount that a company has to receive in order to produce one more unit of product. Okay, so let's just kind of illustrate this. So if the producer is going to supply 1 unit of product, the vendor says, hey, I've got to receive at least $3. And the vendor says, hey, if you want me to supply an additional unit, I'm going to have to get paid $4. And if the market really wants 3 units, they're going to have to cough up $5. And if the market wants 4 units, they'll have to cough up 6. So that's just simply the direct relationship between price and quantity. So if in our market, if equilibrium prevails and price and quantity are set by market forces, the interaction of supply and demand, then the vendor, so equilibrium quantity is going to be 3 units here, equilibrium price is going to be 5 units, the vendor is going to receive $5 per unit for every unit that gets sold, as opposed to $3 for this unit, $4 for that unit, and $5 for the third unit. The vendor gets the same price for all the total quantity sold. So this difference between the price line of $5 for all units versus the line represented by the supply curve is producer surplus. In theory, if the producer could only get $3 for this unit, $4 for that unit, and $5 for that unit, the producer would sell the exact same quantity. But because he would sell the same quantity, and he would simply take $3 per 1 unit, $4 per 1 unit, $5 per 1 unit, so that's 3, 5, that's 9, that's 12. He would take $12. Whereas if the market forces of supply and demand prevail, price equals 5 and quantity equals 3, and he receives $15 in revenue instead. He would be happy with 12, but if he can get 15 because a single price applies to all units sold, then the vendors receive this additional benefit above and beyond what they would be satisfied with. Okay. Oops, I see I'm just kind of out of sync here. Okay, so now we come to this concept of so we relate the concept of allocative efficiency with market equilibrium. So remember market equilibrium, our price, equilibrium price, and our equilibrium quantity are set by the forces of supply and demand. So there's a single price that prevails, and there's a single quantity that prevails at that intersection. And the concept of allocative efficiency says that our economy is at an allocatively efficient point on its production possibilities curve. Point here. Here's our point of allocative efficiency. We're at this point here when the total of consumer surplus and producer surplus is maximized. And this area beneath the demand curve, but above the supply curve, up to the equilibrium quantity, is maximized at this equilibrium price. And if by chance equilibrium quantity was less than, if the quantity in the market was less than the equilibrium quantity, then the consumer surplus is going to be smaller than this big triangle. We're going to lose this little section here. If the economy only produced 2 units, then the consumer surplus is now this little section here, and the producer surplus is only this little section here, and this little section gets lost because we don't have any quantity there. That's known as a deadweight loss. Deadweight loss. So if we're at our equilibrium quantity, we have 0 deadweight loss, and the total quantity of consumer surplus and producer surplus are maximized. That puts us there. And likewise, if we overproduce, if in our economy we produce four units rather than 3, then we can see from the diagram that our marginal cost at 4 units is going to be $6, but our marginal benefit is only $4. So our cost is greater than our revenue. So our revenues, our benefit is only 4. Our cost is 6. So the net is -2. Whereas in equilibrium, our revenue and our marginal benefit and our marginal cost are the same, and so the net is 0. Okay, so when we look at when our market's in equilibrium, we have the optimal level of quantity that's getting produced, and it puts us on the point of allocative efficiency on our production possibilities curve. And we're at that point rather than another point because there is no deadweight loss. If we instead were at this point here, we would be overproducing. We would be overproducing one product, so we would have a deadweight loss from overproducing, and we would be underproducing the other product, and we would suffer a deadweight loss for that product. So when the market's in equilibrium, that puts us at the point of allocative efficiency on the production possibilities curve, and that's the point where there's 0 deadweight loss. Okay. So this next little section talks about deadweight loss. I guess I'm a little bit ahead here. I noticed there's a bit of a typo on the slide. Anyways, what is deadweight loss? So it's the reduced level of consumer and producer surplus due to the quantity of output being at a non-allocatively efficient level. So it's due to the quantity being either less than the equilibrium quantity, so it's underproduction, so its quantity is less than equilibrium quantity, or it's where the quantity of output is greater than equilibrium quantity. And in either one of these situations, we have deadweight loss. And if we have deadweight loss, we're not at the point of allocative efficiency on our production possibilities curve. Okay. Let's just move on. Okay, so this. So in an efficient market, our price and quantity are set by the intersection of supply and demand curves. In an efficient market, this equilibrium quantity will prevail. And when we map that onto our production possibilities curve in an efficient market, we'll end up at our point of allocative efficiency on the production possibilities curve. So that's in an efficient market. So what happens if we have market inefficiencies? And so when we have market inefficiencies, we're not on our point of allocative efficiency. We're someplace else. We're someplace else. We're too much of one and not enough of the other, or too much of the other and not enough of the other one. Okay, so we arrive at a situation of so-called market failure when our price and quantity are not set by forces of supply and demand, So instead of being here, instead of being at price equilibrium, instead of being at this quantity, we end up at this quantity here. We end up at another quantity, quantity 2, and the price is 2. So we're not in equilibrium, and therefore we end up at a different point on the production possibilities curve. So we're at a point of non-allocative efficiency. So we have these 4 types of market failure that we're going to look at over the balance of the slides. So we have so-called externalities, and we have so-called situations where we have asymmetric information, asymmetric info, and then we have a situation of public goods, and then finally we have the situation of common property resources. And just a heads up here, so I posted a little video, an extra video on Moodle this week, and the video talks about this common property resource problem. It's kind of a famous problem in economics. It's kind of interesting actually, but anyway, so we're going to look at these 4 situations where we experience market failure. And remember what market failure means is that we're at a non-optimal quantity of output, which means that we're at a non-allocatively efficient point in our production possibilities curve, or someplace where society doesn't want to be. Okay, so we have these four cases that we're going to look at. So the first one deals with so-called externalities. So we have, okay, so an externality in general, it's where there's a difference between the private cost or private benefit associated with a certain level of output. So there's a difference between the private cost or private benefit and the societal cost or the societal benefit corresponding to that particular quantity of output. So we end up with a quantity that's either less than equilibrium quantity or a quantity that's greater than equilibrium quantity. And we know that if we were in either one of these situations, we have a situation of deadweight loss, and that means we're at a point of non-allocative efficiency. So we're not at the point of allocative efficiency on our PPC. Okay, so that's the concept of an externality in general. And so we have 2 flavors of externality. We have a negative externality, and we have what's known as a positive externality, otherwise known as where's my little thing here? This drives me crazy. Okay, so a negative externality, the authors call it an external cost. So this is a situation where societal costs are greater than private costs. And when we speak about so-called positive externalities, otherwise known as external benefits, this is where societal benefits are greater than private benefits at the private level of output. And I should have put this up there, at the quantity of private quantity. Okay, so let's go through these things. And so we'll see that if we have either negative externalities or positive externalities, we end up with deadweight losses, and that means we're at a point of, we're not at the point of allocative efficiency on our production possibilities curve. Okay, so first we look at so-called external costs. So here's our demand curve for our product. Here's the supply curve from private industry. Here's our equilibrium. Here's our price equilibrium here. And here's our equilibrium quantity over here. So that's the private market in operation. But what we notice that when we have a negative externalities, society as a whole experiences costs that are not borne by the private manufacturer. So if society's costs are higher than, if society's costs, here's our marginal cost curve for society, here's our marginal cost curve for private industry. At this level of output, if societal costs exceed private costs, we have this deadweight loss. So remember before we said if we have a supply curve and costs increase, if costs increase, then the supply curve shifts to the left, S2. So that's effectively what happens here. Here's our private supply. Here's our private supply curve, and if society experiences costs from this production, effectively society's supply curve, rather than the one for the private company, shifts to the left. And what that means is if output was based on total costs, which is private costs plus societal costs, then quantity would decrease and price would increase. And so we would have a lower level of output, and because this is the point that puts us on the point of allocative efficiency on the production possibilities curve. It's society, because this production possibilities curve represents societal preferences, not the preferences of private businesses. So, sorry. So if this is the socially optimal level of output, but in fact we actually have this much output, then we have overproduction in society. When we have overproduction, we have this deadweight loss, because the marginal cost to society, or marginal cost to society, exceeds the marginal cost to private industry. So social costs are higher than private costs. Therefore, we have this deadweight loss. Therefore, society is not at its point of allocative efficiency on the production possibilities curve. And so if we have overproduction, this is a justification for the government to regulate industry. So, you know, a classic example of negative externalities or external costs is pollution. You know, the manufacturer spews its pollution into the air. It just spews its pollution into the air. People breathe the air. People get sick. And so there's all these additional health costs upon society because we have this because we have this overproduction. So in order to force production to shift to the left, then the government might impose user fees on the like water fees or air pollution fees on the manufacturers, in order to get the manufacturer to effectively reduce its level, to increase the cost of the producer, and so the producer will shift its supply curve back to the socially optimal level. So anyways, that's how governments regulate industries that generate negative externalities, is by imposing user fees or pollution fees. And we're familiar with that in Alberta. You know, a lot of the companies in the oil sands, for example, they spew CO2 emissions, and there's a CO2 tax. There's a carbon tax in Alberta, and it's designed to kind of reduce the amount of output of the pollution. Okay, so then we can have the opposite happen. So with an external benefit, we have our supply and demand curve, and so here's our equilibrium quantity of, here's our equilibrium price, here's our equilibrium quantity in the bottom. So when we have positive externalities, otherwise known as external benefits, it means that at the level of output determined by the free market, society actually drives a higher benefit than the private company. So the marginal benefit of society is greater than the marginal benefit of the private industry. Here's society's marginal benefit from this level of output, and here's the private company's benefit from this level of output. So we know that if the marginal benefit exceeds marginal cost, then we're not at the optimal level of output in the society. Optimal level of output is determined where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. And I know we might not fully appreciate that quite yet, but we will in subsequent chapters. But anyways, if our marginal benefit exceeds marginal cost, then we're at a suboptimal level of output, and so the economy should increase its output. So here, if our level of production is only Q1 rather than Q2, we have this deadweight loss. And we know that if we have deadweight loss, we are not at our point of allocative efficiency. We're not at our point of allocative efficiency on the production possibilities curve. We're someplace else. And so society demands more, wants more of that product, and this is again justification for the government to intervene in the market, maybe by subsidizing the cost that consumers pay for this product, so they can consume more. So what are some examples of positive externalities? So an interesting example is people that ride their bicycles to work. If people ride their bicycles to work, that means they're not driving their car. So if you're riding your bicycles to work, riding your bicycle to work, you're getting some exercise, so that's beneficial to you. But if you ride your bicycle to work, you're not driving your car, therefore you're not spewing pollution into the atmosphere, therefore you're not generating harm to people's health. And likewise, if you're not driving your vehicle to work, there's less traffic congestion for the other drivers, and that means the other people who are driving their vehicles to work, because there's less traffic, they can get to their destinations sooner. So there's less traffic congestion. So less traffic congestion and less air pollution. These are positive externalities. These are external benefits due to somebody riding their bicycle to work. So we can imagine that the government might try to encourage people to ride their bicycle to work, maybe by subsidizing the cost of bicycles or something like that. Okay, so that's our first example of the society or the economy arriving at a point of non-allocative efficiency that we're analyzing through deadweight losses. So the next example is where we have so-called asymmetric information. So again, if we have an exchange situation where we have asymmetric information, we're going to end up with some deadweight loss, and we're going to end up at a point of non-allocative efficiency on our production possibilities curve. So just to start this, so we know that the word symmetric means equal, means the same on both sides, the same on both sides. So the classical example of something that is symmetric is our face or our body. Our face and our body are virtually symmetrical on the right and the left sides. And so if we have something that's asymmetric, it means they're not the same on both sides. So if we have an economic exchange where we have asymmetric information, it means the two parties to the exchange, they know, one party knows more than the other party. And so in that kind of situation, one party might be able to take advantage of the extra information that it has, and it can lead to the situation of a deadweight loss and a point of non-allocative efficiency on the production possibilities curve. Oh, I think I got a typo there. Market possess. Jesus, is that spelled correctly? I have to check. I think it is correct. Okay, so we'll come back to this later in the course, but the first example of asymmetric information deals with something called moral hazard. So in a situation of moral hazard, the two parties have different information, and it leads to some bad decision making, and the bad decision making results in losses, and so we have a non-economic level of output. So when we have a moral hazard, I think the example from the book is government subsidization of loan losses. So sometimes governments like to encourage banks to lend money to businesses, and governments come up with what's known as a loan loss program, and we do have these in Canada. Program. So what effectively happens is the government says to the lenders, "Hey, if you lend money to businesses, if you suffer a loss on those loans, then the government will reimburse the lender for those loans." And so what happens is, here's our demand curve for loans, and here's the supply curve. Sorry, do I have this backwards? Oh, I know what it is. Okay, here's our supply curve for loans in the private sector. Oh, I think I have this backwards. Anyways, I'm not going to try to draw it because I think I have my little diagram backwards. But anyways, the marginal cost to society from these the losses from these loans get transferred to society rather than getting borne by the individual lender. And so it increases the supply of loans in the market, resulting in a loss to society. So we have an overproduction of loans. A certain number of those loans go bad, so we have an overproduction of bad loans, and we're looking at loans as a product. So that moves us to a point off of the point of allocative efficiency in the economy. Anyways, so the losses get transferred from the banks, from the private sector to the public sector. And so the public sector program is actually inefficient from the societal perspective. Okay, then I think the very last slide that we look at here deals with the concepts of private goods, public goods, and common property resources. So the authors give us some concepts here that we can analyze the concept of private goods and public goods and then common property resources. So the first concept they give us is the concept of excludable. Excludable. So if a product is excludable, that means the owner of the product can exclude a non-payer from having it. So if we go to a retail store, they own some stuff. If you don't have any money, you cannot buy the stuff. If you don't have any money, you cannot consume it. But then we have some other products that are non-excludable. And this means that people can consume the good even without paying for it. And then we have they introduce the concept of rivalrous goods, which really means a zero sum. If one person consumes something, then the product is no longer available for consumption by another person. But we also have the concept of non-rivalrous goods, which means that more than one person can consume the good at the same time. So we use these concepts of excludable and non-excludable, rivalrous and non-rivalrous to explain the concept of so-called private goods and public goods. So private goods are goods that are excludable. So if you don't pay for it, you cannot consume it, and they're rivalrous. So if one person consumes it, another person can't. So I go to a restaurant, there's a sandwich. If I pay for the sandwich, I get to consume it and you don't. And so if I consume it, you can't consume it because it's in my stomach and it's no longer available to go into your stomach. But when you speak about public goods, they're goods that are they're non-excludable. They're non-excludable and non-rivalrous, meaning that some people can consume them even without paying for them, and that more than one person can consume them at the same time. So there's lots of good examples of public goods. A good example is a military defense. So we in Canada, we pay our taxes to the federal government, and they hire people to operate the army. So if we have visitors to Canada from another country, the visitors don't pay income taxes in Canada. But while the visitors are in Canada, they're enjoying the benefit of the military protection provided by the Canadian military. So visitors get to enjoy the good of public defense without paying for them. And public defense is also another good example of a rivalrous good, a non-rivalrous good, because one person, if the military defends the whole country, one person getting defended doesn't mean other people are not getting defended. So more than one person can consume this good of defense at the same time. So there's lots of public goods. So military protection is one example. Another good example, police protection, fire protection. We have sporting teams that participate in the Olympics. So everybody in the country kind of enjoys the pride associated with successful athletes, but Olympic teams are really public goods because people don't actually have to pay for them out of their own pocket, and one person's enjoyment of Olympic Games does not interfere with someone else's enjoyment of Olympic Games. So Olympic teams are non-rivalrous products. Another good example, kind of one of my favorites, is fireworks displays. Firework displays in a municipality. So the municipal taxpayers pay their taxes to the city or town. The town puts on a fireworks display on May 24th or Canada Day or whatever. But even visitors to the town, if someone is lucky to be in town on those occasions, visitors to the town get to enjoy the fireworks without paying for them. So their fireworks are non-excludable, and more than one person can enjoy them at the same time, so they're non-rivalrous. Okay. So Okay, so I guess the point was, um, well, let's just move on to the final concept here. So we have this final concept called common property resources. So these are goods that are non-excludable, which means they're not paid for, but they're rivalrous, which means only one person can consume at a single point in time. So some classic examples of common resource properties are wildlife. And the best example is a fish in the sea. Fish in the sea, So if you're a fisherman and you go fishing in the ocean or you go fishing in the lake, so if you go fishing in the ocean, you don't have to pay. So the goods are non-excludable, so anybody can go fishing in the ocean. But they're rivalrous because if one person catches the fish, that fish is not available for consumption. It's not available to get caught by another person. So the interesting thing about these common property resources is if people don't have to pay to consume them, but only one person can consume at a time, then there ends up being too much pressure put on that resource. So if there's no way to control fishing in the ocean, or there's no way to control fishing in the lakes, then the fish resource will get over-harvested, and that's to society's detriment. And so it kind of results in overproduction, and we know if there's overproduction, so in this case, the production is due to the producers not paying the full cost of their resource extraction, and so we have overproduction, and so that means we have a deadweight loss, and the deadweight loss means we're at a point of non-allocative efficiency on our production possibilities curve. And so a possible solution to resources that are so-called common property resources is some kind of government regulation. So maybe the government charges for fishing licenses, or in the case of fishing on the ocean, they might have fishing quotas. So when you go fishing, you can only catch so many fish. So kind of the final point here is, so I have a brief video from YouTube of another example of common property resources. It's an economist down in the States. It's made a brief video. It's only 3 minutes long or something. But anyways, he's got an interesting explanation of it and some interesting possible solutions to the problems that can arise with common property resources. Anyways, that's it for chapter 5. So we'll call it a day right there, and talk to you later. I can figure out how to turn this off.